Ich mag diesen Ort, denn hier ist alles schön und ruhig. Ich mag diesen Ort, weil hier alles schön und ruhig ist. Komisch. Warum muss es mich anders ausdrücken, wenn ich weil statt denn verwende? Das finde ich verwirrend. Dann lass uns darüber reden. Das hier ist Lernen und Fahren. Dear Santa, for Christmas this year, I would like a new motorcycle helmet, maybe a new pair of gloves, a higher quality camera would be nice, and, what's that? Oh, sorry, I'm being told that the topic for today is sentence clause. Sentence clause. Oh my, I feel such a fool. And scene. It's my attempt at a comedy bit. So, sentence clauses. What are they and how do we use them? Specifically, the topic for today is going to be to take a closer look at the word order changes that occur in a German language sentence when used with a subordinating conjunction. Great, but what does all that mean? Well, as usual, we're going to break it down. First, we're going to take a look at how it works in English. Then we're going to move over to German and see how it contrasts and compares. So, what is a sentence clause? Well, a sentence clause is a little mini sentence that can appear inside another larger sentence. Now, there's two types of sentence clauses. If the sentence in question can stand alone as a correct and complete sentence on its own, then when it's used as a clause, it's called in English a main clause, also called an independent clause. If, however, the sentence clause cannot stand on its own because it requires or depends on information in the main clause, then instead we call it a dependent clause, also called a subordinate clause. Now, when you combine two main clauses together, the resulting sentence is called a compound sentence. When you combine a main clause with a subordinate clause together, the resulting sentence is called a complex sentence. The terminology here isn't great, but let's go with it. So as an example of a compound sentence in English, I am playing with the cat and the cat is happy. Either one of those sentence clauses could be extracted and could serve quite well as a complete and correct sentence on its own. Therefore, this is a combination of two main sentence clauses into a compound sentence. An example of a complex sentence, which is to say a sentence that combines a main clause with one or more subordinate clauses, would be, I am buying the house because I want it. I want it is not really a complete sentence, because what does it refer to? Well, it refers to the house, but that's introduced in the main clause. Therefore, that sentence depends on information that's present in the main clause. Therefore, that is a subordinate clause when used in a complex sentence. Now, you'll notice that there's little words that we use to join sentence clauses together. Words like and or because. These words are called conjunctions, and the really nice thing about conjunctions is that they do not undergo declension in either language. This is a breath of fresh air. If you think back to the 4-video series that we did on German case, specifically looking at words like articles and adjectives and even nouns that undergo declension in the German language, there's half a dozen different ways of saying things, and you have to think about how am I using it in the sentence and which form of this word is correct here. We don't have to worry about declension in this video at all because conjunctions never change form. The word and is always spelled and pronounced the same way. The word because never changes form. This is great. Now, there's two kinds of conjunctions because there's two kinds of sentence clauses. If you're joining together independent clauses, then you'll use what's called a coordinating conjunction. In English, these are words like and, or, but. I'm not going to go through every single one of them because there's a lot of them. We're just going to cover some of the major ones. Now, there's also, if you're joining together a independent clause with a dependent clause, you'll use what's called a subordinating conjunction. In English, these are words like if, because, before, after, during. Now, look what happens to the word order when we use a sentence in a sentence clause or as a sentence clause. For example, I'm playing with the cat and the cat is happy. If you extract either one of those clauses into a standalone sentence, what happens to the word order? I am playing with the cat is happy. Nothing happens to the word order. It stays exactly the same. That's kind of nice. But what about subordinate clauses? I'm buying the house because I like it. If you expand it in that subordinate clause to the house, I like the house, and then use that as a standalone sentence, what happens to the word order there? I like the house. Nothing happens to the word order there. It stays the same. So this means that no matter whether you're using a independent clause or a subordinate clause in English, the word order will stay the same, which is nice. Now, we could go deeper here because there are different kinds of subordinate sentence clauses, but because the topic of this video is to look at how word order changes in German subordinate clauses in general, I think that's about a decent enough level of detail to dig into. I don't want to get lost in the weeds, so to speak. So that's more or less it for English. There's only one kind of tricky part in English that you have to remember, and that is when you're forming a complex sentence in English. That is, when you're combining an independent clause with one or more dependent clauses, the order of the clauses is a little bit flexible. In English, the dependent clause can either come before the independent clause or after. So as an example, I always drink water before I leave the house. Before is a subordinating conjunction. So we can phrase that in two ways. Before I leave the house, I can always drink water is also acceptable there. There's no change in meaning. It's just a style change. So it comes down to which one of those you prefer to use. It doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. The only tricky bit there is that when you start the sentence with the subordinate clause, you have to stick a comma in between the two clauses in English to separate them. You don't need that comma when you start with the main clause. I always drink water before I leave the house doesn't need a comma. But before I leave the house, I always drink water. There's a comma in between the clauses. Put that in the back of your head and keep it there because we will revisit that in a while here. So now let's look at German. But before we get into sentence clauses in German, let's do a quick recap of something we covered briefly in the previous video when we were talking about separable verb prefixes. Specifically, we mentioned that when you use two verbs in the same sentence clause, the second one will get pushed to the end of the sentence clause and reconjugated back to the full infinitive. We don't do this in English. If you look at a very simple sentence in English, like I see the dog, the direct German translation is Ich sehe den Hund. Now, to see in German is sehen. It ends with an N. Every infinitive in German ends with the letter N, the same way that every infinitive in English starts with the word to. Why? It just does. But we don't say Ich sehen den Hund because we have to conjugate it. It's the same reason you wouldn't say I are happy today. You have to conjugate that verb. I am happy today. So Ich sehe den Hund is the correct conjugation. But if you use a modal verb or a helper verb to modify that main verb, then the main verb gets pushed to the end of the sentence and reconjugated back to that full infinitive. So I can see the dog in German would be Ich kann den Hund sehen. That's literally I can the dog to see, which doesn't mean anything in English. But that's how they phrase things in German. There's that verb push that happens when a modal verb or an auxiliary verb modifies the main verb of a sentence. Now, we covered that in the last video, but keep that in your head because there's a different kind of verb push that can happen in subordinate clauses, and we're going to cover that in this video. But first, let's take a quick look at the general structure of sentence clauses in the German language. It's actually pretty similar, in many cases identical, to English. In German, you also have the concept of main sentence clauses, or independent sentence clauses in English. In German, it's called a Hauptsatz. Haupt means main, and Satz just means sentence. And yes, they have the concept of subordinate sentences or dependent sentence clauses in German as well. They call them Nebensatz. Neben means next to. So if you're not talking about the main sentence, you must be talking about the sentence that's next to the main sentence, Nebensatz. There's also two types of conjunctions in the German language, subordinating and coordinating, the same as we have in English. And in fact, many, if not most, if not all, of our conjunctions have a direct mapping in the German language. So und, aber, oder for the coordinated conjunctions, and then for the subordinating conjunctions, you've got ob, weil, während, before, nachdem, and so on and so on. Now let's look at what happens to the word order in German sentence clauses. Let's start with the easy one first. How about a compound sentence in German? Yes, German has the same two sentence types, generally speaking, that English has. You can form a compound sentence composed of more than one Hauptsatz, or you can form a complex sentence with a Hauptsatz and one or more of a Nebensatz. So if you're forming a compound sentence, I'm playing with the cat and the cat is happy. Ich spiele mit der Katze und die Katze ist glücklich. Glücklich means happy, but confusingly, it can also mean lucky. You've heard the expression happy-go-lucky in English. That's the same word in German. So if you want to be explicit that you mean happy in the sense of like the cat is satisfied, you could switch to a different word there and say die Katze ist zufrieden. satisfied, happy in the sense of, yeah, I'm good. Ich spiele mit der Katze und die Katze ist zufrieden. What if we were to extract these two main clauses into their own standalone sentences? What would happen to the word order? Ich spiele mit der Katze. Okay, nothing happens. Die Katze ist zufrieden. It's the same. So just like in English, the word order in a German main clause does not change if you extract it and use it in a standalone sentence. That's kind of nice. But hang on, because here's where the road starts to get a little bit bumpy. What happens to the word order in a subordinate sentence? I'm buying the house because I like it. Let's first see how we would phrase these two clauses as standalone sentences. I'm buying the house, ich kaufe das Haus. No surprises. Because I like it. How would you say I like it? Let's expand it to the house to make a complete sentence. I like the house. How do we say that in German? Well, you can say ich mag das Haus, but another way of saying that you like something, which is very common in German, is to use the verb gefallen. It means something like appeals to. So the word order is a bit backwards because just like in English, I can say I like the house, or I can say the house appeals to me. Me comes at the end of that sentence. Same thing with gefallen in German, which is very commonly used. Gefallen, by the way, is a dative verb, so we'll say mir instead of mich. Das Haus gefällt mir. We conjugate gefallen to gefällt for singular, for first person singular, and then we say mir after it because it's a dative verb. Das Haus gefällt mir. Okay, great. So how do we put that all together? I'm buying the house because I like it. Ich kaufe das Haus, weil es mir gefällt. What happened there? So the verb got pushed to the end of the sentence, or sentence clause rather, similar to what we do when an auxiliary verb or a modal verb modifies a main verb, but notice that it didn't get conjugated back to the full infinitive gefallen. It stays in its conjugated form. This is the second kind of verb push that can happen in the German language. So when a auxiliary verb or a modal verb pushes a main verb, that main verb goes to the end of the sentence and gets reconjugated back to the full infinitive. There's two things that happen to it. But when a subordinating conjunction like weil pushes a verb, it just pushes the verb as is. That verb does not get reconjugated. Now, if that was it, if that was as far as we had to go on this subject, that wouldn't be too bad. It's a little bit complex compared to English, but it's not too bad. Just a couple extra rules we have to memorize and a little bit of a word order shift. Unfortunately, we're not quite through yet. There's more bumps in the road ahead. So let's keep going. What happens if there's more than one verb in the subordinate clause? Do they both get pushed to the end? Do they get pushed to the end in a certain order? How do we do that? So let's look at another sentence. I'm bringing the dog because he can play with us. How would we say those as separate sentences? I'm bringing the dog would be ich bringe den Hund mit. Mitbringen means to bring something with you, so it's a separable verb as we covered in the last video. But how would we say that second clause? He can play with us. Let's expand he to the dog to make it a complete sentence, and then give a shot at translating that. Der Hund kann mit uns spielen. Can pushes spielen to the end of the sentence. Now, if you were just saying the dog is playing, it would be der Hund spielt. Spielt is the conjugation that you would use with the singular dog. But because can is pushing it, it gets pushed to the end of the sentence and it gets conjugated back to the full infinitive. So der Hund kann mit uns spielen. Okay, great. But what happens if we use that entire sentence now in a subordinate clause? I'm bringing the dog because he can play with us. Ich bringe den Hund mit, weil mit uns spielen kann. What happened there? So spielt got pushed to the end of the sentence clause and conjugated back to the full infinitive by can. It became spielen. Okay, but then can also got pushed by the subordinating conjunction weil, but it didn't change conjugation because subordinating conjunctions don't do that. So you end up with spielen kann, which looks like play can, but no, they get pushed in a certain order. So when you see a pile of verbs at the end of a German sentence, you kind of read them right to left. Spielen kann is can play. Okay, so there's two types of verb pushing happening in that sentence. They're slightly different from one another, but at least it's consistent and at least it happens in a predictable order, so we can kind of parse it and unpack it when we see a sentence like that. Okay, if that was all of it, if that was the end of the video, it still wouldn't be too terrible. But hang on, because it gets a little bit worse. What happens if there's 3 verbs in that sentence? Let's pick a contrived example. I'm bringing the dog because he will be able to play with us. Let's extract that and think about it. The dog will be able to play with us. There's 3 verbs there. Will is a modal verb. Be able to is a verb like can, and then play is another verb. There's 3 verbs there. Great. So how do we say that in German? Der Hund wird mit uns spielen können. Literally, the dog will, with us, play, be able to. That's not how we would say it in English, but that is how they say it in German. Wird pushes both spielen and können, or spielt und kann, to the end of the sentence clause and expands them both to the full infinitive. So kann and spielt becomes spielen können. Der Hund wird mit uns spielen können. Yeah, I know there's a more economical way of phrasing that. You could just say the dog can play with us. That's only 2 verbs, it's easier to say, but let's stick with the 3 verb version of that sentence because it helps illustrate the point. So der Hund wird mit uns spielen können. Now I want to take that entire sentence and use it in a subordinate clause. I'm bringing the dog because he will be able to play with us. Ich bring den Hund mit, weil mit uns spielen können wird. It's the same pattern, it's just more verbs. So specifically, can and spielt both get pushed to the end of the clause by wird, and they both get conjugated back to the full infinitive. But then, wird also gets pushed to the end of the clause by weil. But it doesn't get conjugated back to the full infinitive because weil doesn't do that. And it happens in that order. So again, you get a big jumbled up traffic jam of verbs at the end of a sentence in German. You have to kind of read them from right to left. Spielen können wird is will, be able to play. Okay, if your head is spinning at this point, that's understandable. There's a little bit more ahead, but we're almost through this. I want to take a brief sidetrack here to mention that there's 2 ways to say because in German. There's weil, which directly translates to because, but then there's another word, den. No, I don't mean den as in singular masculine accusative case. I mean D-E-N-N, different word. Den doesn't literally mean because. It translates to English as for in the sense of because. That's rarely used in modern English. But if you want to say something like, I can't come with you because I have no money, in English you can rephrase that as, I can't come with you for I have no money. That's rarely used in modern English. It sounds a little old-fashioned, but it's still valid English. Now, it may be rarely used in modern English, but it's used quite a lot, or the equivalent of a den is used quite a lot in modern German. Ich kann nicht mitkommen, weil ich kein Geld habe. We see that weil pushes habe to the end of the sentence clause. It doesn't reconjugate it because subordinating conjunctions don't do that, but it does push it to the end. If you want to avoid that because it's confusing and it's not like what we do in English, you can switch, in this one case anyway, from weil to den. It means the same thing, it's just a style change. And because den is a coordinating conjunction and not a subordinating conjunction, it doesn't involve that word order change. You can say in German, Ich kann nicht mitkommen, denn ich habe kein Geld. That sounds more natural compared to how you would say it in English because we're not doing that weird verb push that the subordinated conjunctions will do. Okay, back to the main track. There's one more thing we need to cover, and that is the verb comma verb rule. What is that? Well, think back to English when we said that if you start a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, you have to stick a comma in between the 2 clauses. The sentence structure changes very slightly, you just have to add that comma. It doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, but it does change the structure of it just a little bit, or at least how we express it. Something similar happens in German, but with a little twist on it. See if you can spot it. Our example was, I always drink water before I leave the house. First, let's break out those clauses into full, complete sentences and take a look at them. I always drink water in German is Ich trinke immer Wasser. Now you might notice the word order there is slightly different than how we would say that in English. In English, the time specifier always comes in between the subject I and the verb drink. But in German, the time specifier immer comes between the verb trink and the direct object Wasser. Why? Well, it's because the verbs in a German sentence stick rather stubbornly into position 2 in the sentence. If you think back 2 or 3 videos ago when we were going over the dative case, we had an example sentence, I'm giving the ball to the dog, which in German is Ich gebe dem Hund den Ball. And the point in that video was to show that you can mix up the word order in German more than you can in English. In English, we're fairly religiously sticking to subject, verb, object, but in German, for that sentence, you can stick either the subject first, ich gebe dem Hund den Ball, or you can stick the direct object first, den Ball gebe ich dem Hund, or you can stick the indirect object first, dem Hund gebe ich den Ball. Those all mean more or less the same thing. They're just different ways of phrasing it. But notice that no matter how you choose to phrase that, the verb is always in position 2. Same thing here. There's 3 ways that I can think of to phrase I always drink water in German. You can start with the subject, ich trinke immer Wasser. You can start with the object, Wasser trinke ich immer. Or you can even start with the time specifier, immer trinke ich Wasser. It just depends what you want to stress. But notice that no matter how you phrase it, that verb is always in position 2. That's a fairly strict rule in the German language, that verb will always stick in position 2. But now let's look at how we put it all together. I always drink water before I leave the house. If we start with the easy example first, we're going to start with the main clause first, and then the subordinate clause. It is, ich trinke immer Wasser, bevor ich das Haus verlasse. Verlassen is to leave. And notice that, again, the subordinate conjunction pushes it to the end of the sentence clause, but doesn't reconjugate it back to the full infinitive. It doesn't become verlassen. It stays as verlasse. Ich trinke immer Wasser, bevor ich das Haus verlasse. Okay, that's similar to the sentences. In fact, that's identical to the sentences we've looked at so far. No surprises. But when we reverse it, when we reverse the order of the clauses, something strange happens. See if you can spot it. Bevor ich das Haus verlasse, trinke ich immer Wasser. Wait, what happened there? The subject and the verb in the main clause switched places. But I thought we just said that the verb always occupies the second position, and it does. This looks odd at first glance, but it does make sense when you break it down. Look at the complex sentence as a whole. Position 1 is occupied by the entire subordinate clause there. Before ich das Haus verlasse is position 1 in the complex sentence. So what comes second? The verb. The verb always goes in position 2. So before ich das Haus verlasse, trinke ich immer Wasser. So you get that verb comma verb. This is where the name of the rule comes from. If you start a sentence clause with a subordinated conjunction, you know that the last word in that clause is going to be a verb. How do we know that? Because the subordinated conjunction pushes the verb to the end. Whether there's 1 verb or 2 verbs or 3 verbs or a jillion verbs, it doesn't matter. You know the last word in that clause is going to be a verb. And if you're using the subordinated conjunction in position 1 of a sentence, then you know that the first word in the next clause is going to be a verb because that is now position 2 in the complex sentence itself. So, verb comma verb, you'll see it and hear it quite a lot. Weil ich Hunger habe, esse ich etwas. Because I'm hungry, I eat something. You have that habe, comma, esse. Verb comma verb. So there you have a quick flyby of the word order changes that sentence clauses undergo in German when used with a subordinating conjunction. Now, I know that was a lot to take in, and I know that seems a little crazy because there's really no equivalent to this stuff in English. The German syntax at times can look completely alien compared to English. Now, I know I've said this a few times, but it bears repeating because I truly believe it. If you keep going in your language learning efforts, if you keep applying yourself and keep practicing and have patience, this stuff will eventually sink in and start to make sense. It's like when you switch from one motorcycle that you've been riding for years to a different kind of motorcycle. It takes a while to get used to it. The throttle's different, the clutch is different, the brakes are different, everything feels wrong. But eventually, you start to get used to it. Your brain starts to wrap itself around this new way of doing things, and it starts to feel natural. And after a while, you can't remember how you ever did it any other way. You can get there in the German language if you keep going, and one day, you can come back and watch this video again later, maybe much later, and it'll seem like it makes much more sense to you. You'll be able to say, I remember when this stuff used to confuse me. When I first saw it, I thought, there's no way I can possibly understand this. But if you keep going, you'll get to a point where you can say, yeah, you know what? I get it now. I get it now, and it feels natural. After your brain has heard and seen and formulated sentences like this a few hundred times or a few thousand times, it'll start to sink in and it'll start to feel natural. So keep that mental image in your head. It might not seem like you're going to get there anytime soon, but keep going and you will get there.